Hey guys, I want to start this video out with a very important disclaimer, which is I believe that Path of Exile 2 has the potential to be a great game, potentially even the best AA RPG out there on the market today. I think that GGG has carefully crafted a really interesting storyline, visually beautiful game, really get the atmospherics right. There's a lot to really like from a polish standpoint. And of course the combat feels excellent, feels, overall just a really good, solid start of a game. Having said that, the rest of this video is probably going to seem like I'm complaining about an awful lot. So I just think it's very important to throw that up there at first, that I do think this game has an awful lot of potential, and there are already a lot of really good things to like about this particular game. Enough said about all that. Let's go ahead and start diving into what this video is really all about. And I think maybe the way that I would describe this is using an analogy. So in pilot jargon, there is an expression that is basically a pilot needs to try to stay ahead of the plane, which is basically everything is going according to plan, you're thinking calmly, but when the plane gets ahead of you, it's when problems start happening and you start kind of bouncing from one issue to the next, and you're kind of losing sight of the big picture. That's obviously a potentially disastrous situation. Let's apply that. I like to apply that actually to all kinds of different situations. I think it doesn't just apply to flying. I think it applies to all sorts of things. Whatever you're troubleshooting, when whatever it is you're working on starts getting ahead of you, then you find yourself not like really being able to keep thinking about the picture, the big picture, where everything that you're working on should be working towards whatever your main objective is, but instead you find yourself just bouncing from one problem to the next. Now, I don't have a window into the inner workings of GGG, but that's the impression that I have about this game right now. I feel like they are kind of either losing track of the big picture, or maybe I just don't understand what their big picture is for this particular game. So what do I mean by all that? So first of all, let's talk for just a minute about some of the problems that came out with this most recent update. This is, I think, come as a disappointment to a lot of players. It certainly has come as a big disappointment to me, but not a surprise, because when this game first hit early access, they talked about 6 months to a year before it would officially launch with version 1.0. I don't see any way that they're going to make that. Once I realized, and let me just say, like I think a lot of other players, I took a break after about playing it pretty consistently for the first month or so after it hit early access. I took a break for the last few months, and I figured I would wait to see, wait for some more updates and see, how much the game improved over time. But now I can see continuing to do this, dipping back into the game whenever they release new updates, because there's, like I said, there's a lot to enjoy here. But anyway, what I realized as time was passing here after the game went into early access, and then they fixed a few issues in the early going, and meanwhile they have all these new classes that they need to add, they have new ascendancies that they need to add, they have new acts that they need to add, and presumably all that is going on behind the scenes. That's all well and good, but once I saw that months were passing by and no new content was being added, I began to realize, yeah, that's 6 months to a year for them to get the full game out. I just don't see how that's even possible. I was extremely concerned when I heard this great big patch coming out was going to add the Huntress class and 3 new ascendancies, and I thought, well, what are we now, 4 or 5 months into this game, and they had 6 new classes and 6 new ascendancies, each with 3. Each of the classes with 3 new ascendancies. So, they had 6 new classes and 18, 20, and 24 ascendancies that they need to add to the game. And they were, for this great big patch, after 4 or 5 months, only adding 1 new class and 3 additional ascendancies. I thought, yeah, they are way behind schedule in terms of adding in all the content that they need to add in. Along with that, obviously, there's new weapons that they need to be adding in. Obviously, the passive skill tree needs to keep getting reworked every time these things happen. There's an awful lot to juggle, don't get me wrong, and it's a massive game. Balancing is always going to be an issue in games like this, so I recognize that there are absolutely complexities here, and there's reasons why it takes a long time. I just wanted to mention that for people who haven't really thought about this, yeah, there's no way. Well, I should say there's no way. It just doesn't look likely to me that they're going to be able to get this game done for the 1.0 release. Within a year even, let alone the 6 months to a year time frame that I think a lot of us were expecting, and I feel like they had led us to believe that. So anyway, I'm sure they're working extremely hard on it. Obviously, they pulled resources from Path of Exile 1 in order to try to shore up PoE 2, and so obviously they're committed to making this game work. But that leads me into another point here, which is I don't understand their big picture concept of this game. I have mentioned in previous videos that I'm a little concerned that PoE 2 is going to be really a lot more like PoE 1.5, which is it's going to feel like basically the same kind of a game. And what do I mean by that? I love PoE 1. I got an awful lot of hundreds and hundreds, if not more than 1,000 hours of enjoyment out of PoE 1, which for a game that's free, you can't really complain too much about that, obviously. I did obviously spend some money to, buy stash tabs, and also really to express my thanks to GGG for having created such a good game. But PoE 1 has what I believe are some real problems, at least for players like me. I am far more of a casual type of a player and not really the dedicated PoE expert like I think you have to be to really get the most out of that game. I hit a wall. I like to design my own builds. I don't like using build guides. I sometimes watch build guides really more for inspiration or for a better appreciation of the mechanics, but I don't follow them per se because I like buildcraft. I really like games that allow you to sort of experiment and try different things out. And PoE 1 is not a game that rewards that. PoE 1 is a game where you can have a lot of fun through campaign, building your own character, even into mapping, or at least, the early stages of mapping, but you're eventually going to hit a brick wall. And what my sort of theory, my understanding of what has happened to PoE 1 is that there are the players who get really into the science of the mechanics. They get really into the numbers, do numbers crunching, build spreadsheets out, obviously use the path of building tools that are available, create these super powerful uber builds that can completely clear the screen, running through a map where it's 1 or 2 buttons, where they're blinking all over the screen, they're pressing a button and they're melting all the enemies on the screen. They're just clear. They're just, their map clearing is just incredibly fast. Number one, that's not fun to me. I don't really understand why people would enjoy playing a game where you're not even seeing the enemies that you're fighting. You're just walking past them, destroying them with a mouse click. And if they haven't all melted immediately, then you're doing something wrong. On top of that, you're being punished if you're not playing that way, because I think GGG ended up building a game where, okay, they see the power curve here. They see that the blasters are just able to just destroy all the content. Well, that means that in order to make the game challenging for those players, we have to keep making the monsters harder and harder, the debuffs on the maps harder and harder, things like that. And so they end up creating these incredibly difficult challenges for the expert players, which then make your more casual players, those who like to do their own class building, it just leaves them farther and farther behind. So there ends up being more and more content that is just not doable and or not fun for them. And that's fine. I mean, every game company needs to do that. Obviously, they need to make the decision of who is our target audience. And if their target audience is your tryhards who are really committed to absolutely playing the meta all the time, okay, that's fine. That just means players like myself are going to basically get to a point in the game where we're going to lose interest, where we can experience the fun of the campaign and maybe the early mapping, and then we're just going to drop out because, we're going to tap out because, at that point it starts to become a time investment that we're not willing to put into the game because we want to play other games or whatever. So having said all that, none of this is necessarily bad. Like I said, it's just a game company's decision about which players do they want to appeal to. But having said all that, the reason why I talk about all that with PoE 1 is my hope was that PoE 2 would not be the same way. That PoE 2 would not be PoE 1.5, which is going to end up resulting in the same thing where you build these you follow a build guide, you play the game the meta way in order to be uber powerful, and you just start walking through the maps, and with one or two button clicks you're melting all the enemies on the screen. Now, the game is not that way currently, and I appreciate that, and I want to recognize that. I'm afraid that it's going to turn into that, though, and I see some signs that it may. I don't have a problem with PoE 2 feeling like a really challenging game. And in fact, I quite like that. I know it doesn't appeal to everybody, but I do appreciate them making a challenging game. I'm a little bit concerned that the way to get past the challenge in PoE 2 is more and more often going to be, well, follow a build guide and build and use the meta. Don't organically learn the game mechanics on your own. Don't make your own builds and spend lots of enjoyable time planning out your own builds and maybe experimenting with different things and learning to get better at the game that way, but rather just follow whatever the meta is at the time, and that's how you're going to end up clearing the challenging content. To me, that just is not an enjoyable way to play games like this. I really like the other, just as an aside, I like the other AARPGs that allow you to just experiment with your build craft. I think it's a dated game with dated graphics at this point and dated combat engine and whatever, but I think Grim Dawn really excels at the build craft. I think it's a game that really rewards you for just experimenting and trying out different ideas. There's so many different possibilities, and they're pretty well balanced. I think that Last Epoch, for all of its flaws, and I've made videos talking about the flaws of Last Epoch, there's a lot to like about Last Epoch, but it obviously doesn't have the polish of a game like Path of Exile. But it does do a really good job of the build craft. I think that there are some issues with balancing so I'm not going to get into all the different issues of Last Epoch, but what it does do really well is it allows you to build your own character without having to follow a build guide. Once you get a basic understanding for the mechanics, you can certainly have a lot of fun in Last Epoch with a build that you have done 100% on your own, and I really like that. Let's get back to PoE 2. Again, I build these characters on my own, and I can immediately see, obviously, which characters I'm better at than others. Not every playstyle am I particularly good at, obviously, but some of them appeal to me, some of them are a lot of fun, some of them not so much, but I can see that there is a limit to just how much of the game I'm going to be able to enjoy following my own ideas of a build guide. Of a build as opposed to following a build guide. And again, that's just a decision that GGG needs to make. My hope is that long term, they're committed to making it a more accessible game to casuals than what PoE 1 has turned into after all of the power creep that has gone into that game. But I've not heard anything from GGG about exactly what balance they want to strike. What I think is the right balance is for player skill to be half of the challenge and for the right build to be the other half of the challenge. So both of them are important, but you don't have a build that is 95% of the where the character build is 95% of the challenge and player skill doesn't matter. As long as a player is playing with the meta build, they're just going to be able to walk through the content and destroy everything with one or two button clicks. That's just not particularly appealing to me. Okay, so how does that all play into the most recent patch that's just dropped? Well, since I had taken a break from the game, I decided to play a class that I was already somewhat familiar with, where they added a new ascendancy. So I jumped back into the new league and created a mercenary. And the mercenary is a fairly powerful, it feels like a fairly powerful, smooth class to play. And so I was hearing other players complaining about how much more difficult the game is after this patch, how everything got nerfed, and I'm thinking, well, that's not really what I'm experiencing. I just created, as you can see here, a mercenary with basically a 2-button build here. This is still Act 1, the tail end of Act 1, but this is a 2-button build where I'm running around freezing my enemies and dropping grenades on the ones that aren't dying right away. Pretty simple overall build. Obviously, not the most challenging way to play the game, but seems to be pretty effective. And to me, it actually felt like, maybe it's because I've gotten a little bit better as a player, but it just felt to me like going through Act 1 again after these several months just felt easier than the way I remember it from before. So I was a little bit surprised by what I was hearing from other players about the campaign being harder. Now, obviously, a lot of them are talking about later in the campaign as well as mapping, but again, this is just my first impression, was that the game did not seem harder to me. Then after I kind of gotten back into the swing of things with the mercenary, I decided, well, let me go ahead and try the huntress. Okay. Major problem. Completely different experience with the huntress than what I had with the mercenary. So, okay, now all of a sudden it's starting to make a lot more sense. So what's the problem with the huntress? Well, I mentioned that my mercenary had a 2-button playstyle here, where, again, it feels smooth, it feels rewarding, it feels relatively easy. Not a whole lot of brain power required to be effective with the mercenary here. Going back through then Act 1 with the huntress, well, the huntress is quite a bit more complicated, and this is going to appeal to more people. And I don't want to necessarily say that a game has to do this way, but has to do it this way, but my expectation is a more complicated build where you've got more button presses, more dependency on getting timing down correctly. It should probably have a payoff of some kind, like where if you time things correctly and you're using, let's say, a 4-button build instead of a 2-button build, and those 4 buttons aren't just something to be repeated sequentially, but there's timing involved. That particular type of play style, it seems to me, should end up with a sense of reward for getting your timing done correctly, and maybe ultimately be dishing out more damage or being more survivable or something compared to the mercenary 2-button build. Well, my experience with the huntress very quickly was that you use sort of a starting melee attack where you're lunging in. You got a couple different options here, but you're starting out with, let's just basically break it down, like you're starting out with a lunging in melee attack. Then you need to parry, which is based on timing. Then you need to disengage, and then if you've successfully disengaged after parrying, then you get a frenzy charge. Then you throw your spear, and with the frenzy charge, your spear throw will do additional damage. That type of a play style, I can see how it could be fun to have to learn, the complexity of a 4-button build where timing is important, compared to some of your other options that are a lot easier. The problem with it is your damage output overall is lower than it is with your mercenary 2-button build. So there's no payoff. There's no reward. It's a more complicated playstyle. It takes longer to learn how to do it correctly, and the payoff at the end is doing less damage than what you would do with a far simpler build. In fact, I ended up giving up on that playstyle for a while just to learn to just be able to clear some of the content and be able to to learn sort of the basics of how the Huntress feels. I just started doing the melee attack where you create this little whirlwind and then launching my twister, and it just felt like that had better damaging capability than the 4-button build where you had to time the parry correctly. So it just didn't seem to me like it was just built correctly. And it really gets back to what I started off this video with, which is I don't really understand what GGG is doing. I feel like maybe the game has gotten ahead of them instead of them staying ahead of the game. They've already addressed some of the negative concerns that people are voicing, and they're doing it in ways that don't make sense to me. They're just reducing the overall health of all the enemies. That's not really addressing the basic problem. Yeah, it's helping out players who are struggling to get through the campaign, but it's not fixing the underlying problem here. And the underlying problem kind of is one of design, at least with respect to the Huntress, which is, are they trying to reward players for engaging with a more complicated game mechanic, the parry, for example, and all the timing required, and the weaving in and out of melee plus melee and range that the Huntress playstyle is supposedly trying to get you to do. In order for players to really want to engage with that more complicated, more requires much more skill type of a play style, there needs to be a payoff for it, and it's not there. And if after all this time of designing and releasing this major update to the game, if they drop the ball on what was really the focal point of this update, where the class just doesn't feel good, then it really makes me scratch my head about what are they doing with this game. Now, I'm probably making it sound much worse than it is. I wonder how they got through their design and their playtesting and felt like, oh yeah, this is going to be a rewarding experience for players. Having said that, it could just be that I suck with the Huntress, and it could be that lots of other players got the knack of it much more quickly than I did, because I have heard that some players like the new class. That's great. I suspect they like the new class later on in the game, that they grinded through the early game. Maybe they were already really good at the game, and so that, they didn't struggle at all with Acts 1 and 2 or whatever. But I have heard that some players like it, but a lot of players don't. So obviously it's a controversial topic with the player community right now. But to me, I look at it, and as a casual player, it looks like there's fundamentally a bad design problem with this particular class, which is it's more complicated, it's more difficult, and at the same time, it dishes out less damage. It just, to me, that's not a good combination. So anyway, having said all that, it feeds back into what I was talking about before, which is what are GGG's plans for this game overall? What kind of a game do they want it to be, and what players do they want it to appeal to? And to me, that still remains to be seen. I have great concerns right now about how this game is going to develop, because I don't understand what they're doing with it. It does look like they're behind schedule on it. It does seem like, based on their reaction to the negative feedback that they're getting, they're throwing a Band-Aid on instead of addressing the root of the problem. And there's other examples of this. I'm still very concerned about the way that the trials work. I think there's massive flaws, at least the way that I remember the trials. There's massive flaws in the way that the trials work. I think there's a big problem with armor and evasion and energy shield not being balanced. And I kind of, again, wonder what were they thinking when they designed this stuff to allow such humongous problems to creep into the game from the very beginning? I just would have expected them to have nipped these things in the testing, if not before, and realized that they needed to address it rather than releasing a game with these deficiencies to the public and then waiting for the feedback. I realize that's what early access is for, is to get feedback from the player community, but like the problem with armor is something that really needed. They didn't need the player community to identify this problem. That's something that they should have identified for themselves. So I don't like the idea where you have to build a warrior, or let's say the mercenary, or one of the classes that's not intended, quote unquote intended. I realize that one of the strengths of PoE is that there's such flexibility where there's nothing wrong with building a warrior and using energy shield on him, but yet the way that the class is quote unquote intended to be sort of the archetype of the class, maybe that's the way I should put it, is it's supposed to be an armor based class. The passive skill tree kind of, is a little bit, for a new player coming in just learning the warrior, you would expect them to build a warrior around armor. And as we start to look more and more at the meta and we realize, oh no, what you got to do is you've got to build your mercenary with an energy shield build because it's just so much better than armor. And, I'm just throwing this out there as a hypothetical example. That's a problem when you're basically making the game sort of deviate from the archetypes because it's just so clearly imbalanced in certain ways. So, all right, I was kind of hoping to get this in less than 20 minutes, and I see now that I'm up to 27. So obviously, I have rambled on a bit much here, but I just wanted to kind of give my impressions of the state of the game. And I welcome feedback. I know there's going to be people that disagree with some of my takes here. Again, this is coming from the perspective of a casual, and they're, not every casual is going to agree with me, and certainly people who are experts in the game are going to disagree with some of the things that I said here. But this is my perspective. I play a lot of games. I don't devote my life to any one of them. Even Warhammer, which I obviously play far more than any others, and particularly with the videos on this channel, but I still play a lot of other games. And so my expectation of a really good game like PoE would be one that is a little bit more intuitive, a little bit more accessible to people who don't want to follow a build guide, who just want to do their own build craft. Taking the time to learn the mechanics, of course, but not necessarily, using a path of building or following a build guide or what have you. I just worry that the game is going to turn into the uber powerful builds that do map clears really quickly, and that's the way that the challenges are going to be built, is to appeal to those players, which is then going to leave the rest of us in a position where we're just going to be like, oh, okay, well then there's just going to be all these parts of the game that just we're not ever going to be able to do, or they're not worth the frustration or the investment in time, and so we're just going to enjoy half of the game. We'll enjoy the campaign and then stop playing, which feels to me like a wasted opportunity, both in terms of this game in a vacuum, but more in terms of, I feel like there should be distinct differences between PoE 1 and PoE 2. They should probably be able to capture two different types of audiences, since they've got these two different games. And if they end up just capturing the same audience with both games, that just seems to me like a wasted opportunity. All right, anyway, want to go back to what I originally said as the last comment here, which is I do think the game has a ton of potential, and there's already a lot to like about it. I'm still playing it despite the fact that I'm seeing these deficiencies in it. I just would like to give my feedback out there into the ether so that just in case anybody at GGG hears it and can appreciate that this is one of many different perspectives on this game. And again, I hope that they have a plan, and I'm just not understanding it. But I look at it, and it looks to me like they're bouncing from, they're releasing both the original early access release and now this update. They're releasing a game that's highly flawed and noticeably flawed. And I just kind of wondering how they didn't catch these flaws in their design and their own testing. And then as they're reacting to the problems, it just seems like it's taking them a very long time, and they're not necessarily going about it in a way that fills me with a whole lot of confidence that ultimately it's going to be addressed the right way. Like I said, the armor thing is a big problem. The trials is a big problem. The way that they've addressed the Huntress is a big problem. The way that the more complicated play style is not really being rewarded is a problem. Anyway, there's just enough. The way that they're just blanket lowering the health of all the enemies to make the game easier. It just, again, these are concerns that I have. All right, I'll go ahead and leave it there. Again, thanks for listening. Feel free to start a discussion. I think that that's the nice thing about these YouTube videos and about the growing sense of community in the video game world is that we can have these discussions, and game companies do pay attention to it when the voices get loud enough. So that's sort of my hope here. But all right, anyway, thanks everybody, and I will see you all in the next video.